I'm excited to share some ideas. Probably I'll bring everyone back to a classroom setting. My research is in a broader sense, looking at bioclimatic design, reducing carbon emissions. I like to bring a global perspective to my research as well as my teaching, and particularly, using different gamification strategies in a classroom setting. I found it so fruitful, and I'd like to offer, some examples, and perhaps if needed, I'm happy to also show some demos. As Peter has very nicely introduced my work, I currently I'm an assistant professor at Northeastern University. Previously, I was a Ph.D. student at MIT, and most of my teaching and research has been, developed during my time as a graduate student, and now I'm further expanding them and really working through dissemination. I like to start with this slide because for me it speaks so much. It's an evidence that climate is being ignored, especially looking at the fast-growing urban centers around the globe. With the advancement of technologies, now it has become actually difficult to differentiate some of the buildings in different locations. As you can see here, buildings in a heating dominated climate versus in a cooling dominated climate or temperate climates might end up looking similar, which is so different from what was the trend, say, 100 years ago. Taking it a bit further, looking forward, we know by 2050, the building stock globally would double. And research shows that 68% of world population would live in cities. In this figure, it shows the distribution of the existing building stock and what needs to be built by 2050. The gray shades in each pie shows what is expected to be constructed. As you can see, in the majority world, looking at emerging economies, African continent, places like India, China, there is a need to construct more than double of what we have. So that by itself is really a call for more education on decarbonization, perhaps not just locally, but thinking globally. And initiatives like the BDLA, I think they have so much opportunities even outside of the US. Looking at the impact of global warming on temperature increase, one data we can really observe is the increase in the use of AC units in different parts of the world. Here in this figure, I just summarized some data comparing the year 2000, 2010 to 2020 for different parts of the world. We know the market in the US is somehow saturated. Almost 90% of homes are equipped with AC units. But in places like India, which are much more warmer and much more humid, the penetration is only 5%. And we can imagine in the coming decade how much increase we might observe. And thinking about limiting global warming to less than 1.5%, 1.5 degree or 2 degree centigrade by 2050, we know we have to think about decarbonization. That's the only opportunity where building net zero buildings, retrofitting buildings, where we can get to that goal. It's just reiterating the theme of the conversation we have today. So really, this leads me to think about, I think Emery has very nicely articulated it in his presentation, the importance of design. So it's not about technologies, but it's also about, really having, giving the platform for good design, efficient design. So empowering architecture and evolving the design attitude is so important. I believe it's important for us to always think about passive strategies as much as possible and always complementing with technologies whenever it's needed. So as illustration of that, part of my work has been developing an online web tool to support bioclimatic design rather than only focusing on simulation tools, which require some computation power of our gadgets, or even some knowledge or skill to run the simulations, creating a web app that can be accessible anywhere for anyone who has access to, say, a cell phone or a laptop that's internet connected, to give them the opportunity to explore various building strategies would be so helpful. An expansion of that is really implementing such an approach even in the learning space. I think taking students into these three different stages of learning is quite critical. So the first part, of course, we emphasize on skill building and the basic principles, physical principles would be learned. And then the opportunity comes to apply whatever they learned through evidence-based design, which could be using, this web app or using these BIM environments for building performance simulations. And third, the goal would be to take them across, applying what they learned and perhaps come up with new innovative ideas in their course projects and assignments. So one approach to really teach them about the different sustainable building strategies and the importance of decarbonization is implementing different games in a classroom. So instead of just providing assignments, my colleagues and I, have been using gamification as a way of teaching. I'd like to probably present three different games or challenges that could be used in a classroom, or the games that we've been implementing in a classroom. The first one is a climate game, then a simulation game, and then an alternative for the simulation game, a ClimaPlus challenge. So usually the ClimaPlus would be administered at the beginning of the course, where students are yet learning about different parameters of the climate and learning to read different climatic charts. The simulation game comes usually towards later in the course, after students have learned how to do some performance simulations. They learned about thermal envelopes, they learned about thermal mass, they learned about different heating and cooling strategies. This simulation game is usually administered using, say, Rhino, Climate Studio. So in a scenario where those tools are not accessible, I, as an extension of the ClimaPlus project, we developed the ClimaPlus challenge, which I would discuss in depth. So the first to approach the climate game, the simulation game, have been discussed and presented at the symposium at MIT last September. And perhaps, there would be more documentations coming out of the symposium. So to dive deeper with these different games, the first one, the climate game, is quite interesting. It's the simplest, but at the same time, it's the one that strikes so much conversation in a classroom setting. Now we know, climate data is publicly available. We have more than 3,000 locations made available on onebuilding.climate.org, which can be easily downloaded. So we give students the challenge of identifying a location, comparing climate, describing it, and also coming up with some design strategies. So what happens is we prepare climate boards, a couple of climate boards without disclosing their location. Usually the preparation for the game could take about 1 hour for the instructor outside of classroom, and it could require about 20 minutes to run the game in a class. So once the climate boards are prepared, then we ask students to look at all the climate boards, and we give them a series of options of locations, and we ask them to match them. So they would now have the opportunity to, look at, okay, what's the sun path? They look at the psychometric chart. They look at, the cumulative radiation map, wind charts. We provide temperature charts. And they usually, once they have, kind of spent some time exploring the charts, they should be able to identify which climate board belongs to which climate or to which location. So what's surprising is, of course, maybe not even that much surprising, but some climates are much more obvious. For instance, this is a result of their matching. Usually we gather their responses in a form and show them the summary at the end of the game so that they even have an idea which climates were clear and which climates could have been confusing and why. So as you can see in these pie charts, the first climate, it's for Anchorage. It's the coldest climate. It was the easiest, so everyone was able to 100%, identify it. But we learned that, for instance, Phoenix and Nairobi were confusing for most of the students. And we also identified, wind charts are usually the most difficult to associate for students. But in any case, we would dive deeper into any of the climate charts, spend some time really investigating why, which climate could be identified, which parameter they should really look into. So this becomes a fantastic opportunity to really think about bioclimatic design, like the early stage identification of climate parameters. So I personally use the ClimaPlus web app extensively for my teaching, but the CBE Clima tool, which is out of the UC Berkeley lab, the CBE Clima tool is also very powerful. It can be implemented. People could implement the Ladybug tools. It's also possible to use a climate consultant. There could be different options outside. These two web apps are the ones I'm very much familiar with, and it's possible just to compile various climate files into climate boards to really create the game. The second one, the simulation game, which could be quite interesting for many of you, I believe, is it's a game where students are asked to form groups. They would be provided with an assignment brief. They'd be given 90 minutes, close to 1.5 hours or 2 hours within the classroom, where they start first by sketching out their design. They'd be given a particular site. They would have site conditions, they would have a location, they would have a program to design for. They'd also have a budget described in simulation game dollars. So at the end of the day, students would be running, trying out various geometries, different construction types, different conditioning strategies to arrive at the lowest energy as well as the lowest carbon within the simulation game dollar budget. Usually the preparation for this game could take up to 4 hours for the instructors outside of the classroom, and within the classroom, as I mentioned earlier, up to 2 hours would be sufficient. So the takeaway from this game for the students is they would understand the association or the importance of climate insight on the impact of the building performance. They would learn how to translate and interpret simulation results. They'd also explore EUIs, cost and carbon as a way of optimizing building performance. They would explore iterative design process as a way of performance simulation. They'd also learn to work within constraints, such as budget and area limitations. The simulation game, as it's designed right now, runs within Rhino with a plugin Climate Studio out of Solama. It also has a plugin for Grasshopper, which runs. I'm able to show a quick demo if anyone is interested, but I'm also happy to share some files afterwards. So what the results could look like, usually the winner of the game would be the group that had arrived at the lowest energy, at the lowest carbon within the given simulation dollars. And as you can see in this image, it's just showing 10 different examples of projects. And for each of the different groups, you can see a series of simulations that have been run. And the goal is, of course, at the end to arrive at the lowest carbon values. The third game, which could be taken as a good alternative to the simulation game in a scenario where we don't have our students or learners don't have access to Rhino or Climate Studio, or we don't want to get into the Energy Plus simulation space, is to use the web app using ClimaPlus. So I implemented an engine at the back end, which takes in design constraints, such as climate, the program, and some comfort requirements by the occupant. And then we have a non-geometric abstraction of a building, which helps translate some of the building performance into the analytical model. So those parameters include the performance of the envelope, lighting loads, plug loads, thermal mass infiltration, and conditioning, heating and cooling, or natural ventilation strategies. So this abstraction of buildings ideally could, it's like a shoeboxer in a way, but with the goal of really promoting comparison of different performance strategies. It could represent a full building, but it could also be representing parts and sections of a building typology. It could have different dimensions, different orientations of openings, and window-to-wall ratios. So once the student access the ClimaPlus tool, ClimaPlus.net, they would be able to input or select a location. For instance, in this case, I'd like to show maybe how a scenario can be compared. So if the student wants, if the assignment is, say, optimizing a building for Boston, they can pick a location, Boston, then it leads to a settings a window where they can kind of select the dimension of the Clima box, and they can choose different window-to-wall ratios. They'll be able to specify construction, specify the presence of thermal mass. They can also pick different conditioning. So let's say for the base scenario, a group, maybe a student, starts working at a low envelope performance scenario for a fully conditioned office building in Boston. And then in their second and third scenarios or iterations, let's say in the first scenario, they change the construction, they upgrade the construction to a good performance envelope. They also improve infiltration by making it more tight. Then in the second scenario, they could add a bit of thermal mass. They can also make it hybrid by adding operable windows. So instead of just relying on active heating and cooling, whenever the climate permits, natural ventilation would be used. And as a result, these are the output results for the three scenarios. As you can see, in comparison to the base scenario, on the third scenario for the hybrid optimized building type, heating has been reduced close to 80% and cooling has been reduced 40%. And even taking it further, what's more exciting for me is for students to be able to compare fully conditioned versus a hybrid system. We know every climate offers at least a bit of opportunity for having natural ventilation, if not, fully naturally ventilated. So in this scenario, in addition to looking at energy loads or carbon emission, operational carbon emissions, they would be able to look at discomfort hours due to high temperature. So now the conversation becomes even more interesting because, do we want to have a hybrid system where there might be a couple of, hours with higher temperature versus having more heating and cooling involved? So I think the conversation on bioclimatic design could be expanded even beyond having mechanical systems in the building. So one thing which is has been really successful was implementing some of these game ideas and these tools in an open online course, a MOOC course that was launched in collaboration with the Sustainable Design Lab, the MIT Energy Initiative, and edX. And with that course, we were able to kind of reach more than 46,000 learners in different parts of the world. Close to 170 countries were represented. In the earlier versions, majority were from the US, Brazil, and India, but the goal is for us always really to have more learners coming from other countries as well. And this is where I see, maybe as a closing statement, this is where I also envision, my contribution maybe to the BDLA, since it's a resource that's globally really available, thinking about making these strategies kind of expanded and available for even learners outside of the US. Thank you so much. I'd be so happy to answer questions or take feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arsano. Let's see, I just see one question about, have you included a kilowatt power draw from the grid constraint in the US? It's showing up as the high cost to upsize electric panels above 24 kilowatt, 100 amps.
So that's a good question. I see in the future, I think we can definitely expand the analytical models and these games outside of the billing scale. So far, we're just looking at the end use, but that would be I think that would be an interesting addition. For now, we're just allowing students to compare, okay, what kinds of modifications could make improvements on the performance of the billing. Per se, the goal is to have like a particular specific number, but rather have a good comparison so that they know which strategies would work better than others, what improvements would be preferred for a particular location versus other location.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions for Professor Arsano? All right, well, thank you. And if you would like to volunteer to share your teaching methods, please raise your hand or put something in the chat so we know. Oh, wait, there's one more question. Sorry,
Okay.
just one more question.
Go ahead.
Are you using this in studio classes? IT would satisfy, or it would satisfy the new accreditation requirements.
Okay, so I use it extensively for, say, environmental systems course. It's one of the required courses in architecture. It does qualify some of the NAB requirements in that course. We haven't yet made it one of the requirements for studio classes. But usually students who have taken these environmental systems courses would take some of the tools and some of the approach and use them later in their studio courses, if that's the question.
Okay, I don't see anyone wanting to volunteer about teaching. Were you starting to say something, Peter?
Let me just say one quick thank you to Professor Arsano. You guys, everybody else, you can see why I wanted her to talk about what she's doing. I think it's so exciting and fantastic and just sort of next level as far as the way of teaching. And I really would welcome you to let us know as you're doing more of this massive online teaching method. We'd be more than willing to, get the word out if that would be helpful. And it's interesting on the BDLA, we've started to, again, it's not been a target for us, but we're getting more and more international professors that are plugging in to the work. We had a group from Ecuador a week or two ago, and we've got some professors even from Africa and India who are very much engaged with what we're doing. So I just want to congratulate you, Professor Arsano, on what you're doing and encourage you to keep up the great work. So yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anybody who would like to share some of their thoughts, we would love to hear from you. and some of your experiences on, where are students these days and what's the best way to get through to them. So go
We
ahead,
have
Lindsay.
Eric. Yeah, Eric just raised his hand. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I am unmuted. Do you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Wonderful
Yeah.
presentation. I love everything that I've seen so far. I think it's really exciting. If it's exciting to me, then it's even more exciting to the students. I think it's just really sort of energetic. And it's, I think it's one of those things where you can really sort of add these components to the game component. And the one thing that I really enjoy doing with students is getting them sort of back out into the field. And you don't necessarily need instruments, but you need more observational understanding. And behaviorism and decarbonization are intrinsically kind of like stitched to the hip, right? I mean, that behaviorism is so critical. And so I sort of deploy my students into, different buildings, commercial buildings, and I have them make observation of how people use space and the possibilities of reductions of energy and why people turn on lights when they have, excessive daylighting conditions, So the observational component, the sort of the psychology of decarbonization, I think could be a very easy piece to add to what I've just seen, because again, it doesn't necessarily require tools. It doesn't have to, it could be very much integrated into an online component because you're asking students to kind of get out and go observe. All I do is I give them a little bit more criteria as to what they're, specifically looking for and how to monitor it. And they do it over a session of several weeks, and then they work with the occupants to then see how they could change behaviors in order to sort of lead to energy efficiencies, be it HVAC, thermal comfort, lighting, you name it. But just thought I'd share that because I think that all these tools combined could make for a really exciting exploratory nature for students trying to better understand what this is all about.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah.
And then we have another hand raised. It doesn't have your name, but it's ARCD.
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and you can't see me though, apparently. I turned my camera on. I don't know what happened. My name is Steve Padgett. This is one of the school's iPads that I'm using, and that is not my name down there. It's unless I'm AI, maybe that's what's going on. But what I wanted to point out is I don't know how many architecture professors are here, but most of us know that now the new accreditation requirements include having to use measurable building performance factors. Each student has to demonstrate this in making design decisions, which means it's not at the end. It's not after all the decisions are made, and then you do an energy model, you do other, airflow, you do lighting and daylighting and so on. You have to do it during the design process. So if anybody, I mean, this was great. This Alpha's presentation, that's great stuff. I was taking screenshots very quickly. But all of us are still in a muddle. This is new enough that we don't really know what our peers are doing. We don't know exactly how this is all happening. I have some experience in all of this, but we don't, as a whole faculty, know what the heck we're doing. We're trying to do lots of stuff. Anyway, if anybody has anything to add on that, I'd really appreciate it.
I don't see anyone else's hand raised, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I told NAB, by the way, the accreditation board, I told them that they're about 20 to 25 years behind, because all they did was say measurable building performance factors as they help to make design decisions. And I said, but you have all these platforms right now that have been in development over 20, 25 years that have very specific performance factors that are measurable, and they even show you how to measure them. What are the references, what are the standards, et cetera. And they go, well, we're just looking for what the schools are going to do. So architecture, what can I say?
You know, we have one of our emeritus or long-standing professors who's been teaching building performance, Professor Brian, in the meeting. Would you be interested in sharing something? I think you probably have more experience than anybody here. If you're interested in sharing a couple thoughts, just please unmute yourself. Okay. The gentleman who just spoke, I think you need to mute yourself now. There's some typing or something. Anybody else want to add something? If not, we can go ahead and wrap up. We really, I think this whole idea of what's the best way to teach building decarbonization is something that's evolving. It's not something that we've, you know, have a long runway on. So I think it's exciting. Okay, I see Jonathan Unaka. Would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hello. Sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I won't show myself. My question is, we've been experimenting with a lot of these games, and thank you, Arsano, Professor Arsano, for those. We use many of those, and more. One area that I think that there is a lack in terms of the games. You know, I really love to do games with my students. It's the days we do games are the days all the students come. Like the attendance is 100% on game days. So I'm trying to make all my assignments games. That's like my goal, other than putting the air conditioning industry out of business. But one question I had is, are there similar games for embodied carbon? Because, you know, we've done so well on building operations over the last few decades, but embodied carbon is still kind of, you know, hasn't moved as much. So I was curious your thoughts on that, Alpha.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think we had this conversation even last time with Peter, which is so critical, and thank you for bringing it up. You know, when we think about embodied carbon emissions, of course, we have the embodied carbon and we have the operational energy. With these tools, it's quite easy to kind of predict the operational carbon side of it. But I also find it quite challenging to bring it in a very easy and approachable manner to the classroom, especially for the embodied carbon. I haven't seen any good example that could gamify the conversation on embodied carbon so far. I think a tool called SAM from NREL, they have a good database and some resources regarding materials and emissions. But perhaps maybe it's possible to create a version of the game which may not be up to, you know, current information or may not represent rich scenarios, but just for educational purpose. I can imagine maybe creating a game which could be a representation of various scenarios, but I can see the difficulty of really predicting embodied carbon and bringing, you know, comparison of scenarios as much as we do with the operational carbon.
You know, I might add that Epic tool could potentially be a component of a game relating to embodied carbon because they do have some of the simplified calculation methods in there.